All right, everybody, welcome back to the #1 television program in the history of the entire universe. I am Brian Lee Durfee, author of the 5 Warrior Angels series published by Simon & Schuster Saga Press. We are coming at you from Hollywood today in celebration of the L. Ron Hubbard Writers of the Future Volume number 9. And I am here with the legendary S.M. Sterling, who's written probably dozens and dozens of science fiction fantasy books, including one of my favorite series of all time, the Change series, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But let me just talk to you about Writers of the Future now. How long have you been involved in it, and what do you think that the Writers of the Future contest has done for the genre of science fiction and fantasy as a whole?
Well, I've been involved for, 3 years, since late 2019. As for what it's doing for the genre, it gives people who are starting out a platform to get professional recognition. That isn't easy. It wasn't easy when I started out in the field, and it's even less easy now. So the quality of the stories I've been judging has been extremely high. Every one I've seen has been a publishable quality, which made picking the winner sort of subjective and extremely difficult. But it's not easy to get your name in print, and that's an essential first step. Yes, when you first time you see it, you think, I've arrived, and then you look up and there's another mountain ahead of you, but you have climbed a substantial cliff.
Yes. And what do you think this contest has done to help launch the careers of dozens of our most well-known science fiction fantasy authors today?
It has helped launch their careers.
Yes, basically I answered the question by asking it.
Yes, you did.
So let's move on from the Writers of the Future contest and into some of your own more personal work. I want to talk about the Change series. What was your inspiration for that? You've got this trilogy, which is starts with, and I'll hold it up now, but I will also put I will edit a big nice picture in there for you people to watch, get a good look at the cover. That trilogy, and then you've got another part of the Change series that's about 12 or 15 books long?
15 books. That starts with Dies the Fire. Well, actually, I got the idea for Island in the Sea of Time, which displaces the island of Nantucket back to 1250 BC. When I was on Nantucket, I honeymooned on Nantucket in '88 when Jan and I married. And we went back every year as often as we could afford it. So shortly before Island in the Sea of Time was written, in the late 90s, we were on Nantucket. We were taking a nighttime stroll on our favorite beach, and I saw the lights of a ship going by out in the distance, and I thought, you know, Nantucket feels very isolated, but of course it isn't really. There are daily flights in and all the telecommunications and so forth. And then I thought, what would it take to really isolate Nantucket? And the idea came to me, and we turned around and went back to the hotel, and I started taking notes. And I did the research about Nantucket itself exhaustively in the next couple of years, and then I wrote the book. And this was a turning point in my career. Because originally I wrote it for Jim Bain. And Jim was a very smart guy, and he had excellent judgment as far as the field goes, except when he got a crotchet or a bee in his bonnet. And he did about this. He hated it. He said, to boulderize slightly for publication, for mass communications, I can't make the audience consume fecal matter. And he wanted me to completely revise it. And I refused. And we talked around it, and eventually he agreed to publish it as is, but I knew he'd drop it in a black hole because he really didn't like it. And so I yanked it. I had to pay back the advance. I was broke, but it was a matter of principle. Now, normally I don't mind revising to an editor's suggestions. I'm a professional. I'm not a prima donna. But in this case, the suggested revisions would have completely transformed the book, and I thought it was pretty good, damn good. So I yanked it. And then Harry Turtledove, who's a friend of mine, and has been for quite some time, put me in touch with his agent. Jim didn't like his authors having agents. He was going to look after them, sort of a paternalistic thing. Russ Galen, who is a god among agents, and I've been with him ever since. And Russ said, send me a copy and I'll read it. So I sent him a copy, and then I called him up next week, and I said, did you like it? And he said, Steve, there's only 2 ways to get me to read a 1,000-page manuscript. This was in the days of hard copy. Over a weekend, and one is if I like it, and the other is if you're standing next to me with a gun in my ear, and you weren't. So yes, I like it. So he made 2 simultaneous submissions up for it, to Tor and to a line that's Rock, that Penguin was putting out at the time, and it was accepted by both within 2 weeks.
Oh, cool.
And he said, Tor will do it as an original hardcover and it'll get lost in the shuffle because they do an awful lot of original hardcovers. Laura Ann Gilman, who was the editor who bought this for Rock, he said she's just starting out, it's a new line, she'll push it hard. So I went with her, and well, it's now in its 33rd printing. So if Jim, God bless him, were still here, I would get to say, I was right and you were wrong, so I get to sing the I was right song. So I wrote that and the 2 sequels. But they did reasonably well. Quite well, actually. Not like stellar, oh my God, well, but well. And they've been selling consistently ever since, which is why it's in its 33rd printing, and I'm still getting royalties for it more than 20 years later.
And the basic premise is life on Earth is going as normal, and then all of a sudden we have no electricity or no...
Well, that's what happens in the world that Nantucket leaves. So, you know, I thought about that. What happens when in the world Nantucket leaves? And then I came up with the concept of the change, which is basically a sudden drastic alteration in the laws of nature, which takes place at 6:15 Pacific time, 1998, which is exactly the same time that this happens to Nantucket. As a matter of fact, the characters in Dies the Fire, the protagonists, one of them is flying a light plane over the Bitterroot Mountains in Idaho, shuttling an affluent family to their summer ranch, and they hear there's radio confirmation that some weird thing is happening to Nantucket. There's a big dome of lights over the island, and then suddenly everything cuts out, including the engine, and the plane has to be crash landed. Events ensue from that.
Yeah, and so there's no electricity, no combustion, no engines will work. All of these things go wrong, and you've got all these characters in the Change series living on the West Coast now. But you also incorporate a lot of other, as the series moves on, a lot of other people start to come in and infiltrate. And what gave you the idea for having sort of the Renaissance Fair, SCA kind of people sort of prosper very much in this post-apocalyptic society?
Well, it's not exactly that they prosper; it's that they suffer just slightly a less complete disaster than everyone else. Okay, basically, high-energy technologies stop working. No electricity, although our nerves keep working. No combustion engines except atmospheric pressure steam engines, which still work, but the only thing they're good for is pumping out coal mines where fuel is very good. Because they're big and heavy and very inefficient. Guns don't work. This disconcerts several of my protagonists. And who knows how to use swords and stuff like that, and who has armor and swords that they keep as a hobby? Well, the SCA, Haka Arma, and a number of other recreationist groups who practice Renaissance fencing or medieval combat techniques, that sort of thing. And that is a substantial advantage when suddenly guns are just oddly shaped clubs.
Yeah. Well, I can vouch for it. It's an amazing series. I've read them all. I think they're just great post-apocalyptical type fiction.
Hear him.
And,
right.
And there will be links for these that you can purchase underneath the video. Who were some of your influences as a young writer?
As a young writer? Well, everyone and everything. I started reading before I went to first grade. My parents read me classic British fantasy work called Naughty Red Lion Beware, about the adventures of heraldic shield animals who come up, down off their shields at night. And I memorized it and taught myself to read that way, which means I learned to read English as if it was hieroglyphics or Chinese ideographs, because I memorized the look of the entire word, which did weird things to my spelling later. But then I could read it, and I started reading other things. And I read Edgar Rice Burroughs, I read Doc Smith, I read all the classic pulp authors. Later on, I moved on to Poul Anderson, who I got to know, and was a very nice guy. And Larry Niven, met Dave Drake, did some books with him. My first book was the product of the only academic course I ever took that actually helped me with writing. It was in high school. There were 4 of us and a teacher. They gave us a bunch of paper at the beginning of the year and said, you're going to write a book. We'll meet once a week, and if you have problems, come and talk to me. So I wrote a book. It was a terrible book, sort of an Edgar Rice Burroughs, Robert E. Howard pastiche with bits of Lovecraft thrown in. Fanfic of the worst sort. And, you know, a lot of fanfic is actually good. This wasn't. But I learned a good deal writing it. Writing is one of those things you have to do to learn. I know some people who wrote very good first books in their teens, and a couple of them are my friends, even though I sort of hate them for that. But most people have to learn by doing, and I was one of them. Published my first book after writing it in law school. I did a dual major in English and history for my BA. I love history. The English courses were interesting, but absolutely worthless as far as writing goes, except that I got to read a lot of books, and that's important. The history was extremely valuable, and I really enjoyed history. I thought of being a history professor for a while until I learned a bit about what you had to do to become a history professor, and it was a better job back then than it is now. It was easier to get a tenured position. So my mother convinced me that I had to have something practical in my background, so I studied law, hated it, wrote my first book, Snow Brother, which was published by Signet in '84, and never looked back. I sold that to Sheila Gilbert, and she said, it's nice, but it's not fantasy enough, so I added 15,000 words in An Evil Magician.
Oh, you got to do it. So anyway, last question. What do you have any future projects you want to talk about, or what do you think about the future of science fiction and fantasy? How do you think that's going to?
Well, science fiction and fantasy, often in visual form, have more or less conquered popular culture.
Sure has.
I can remember when, if they made a science fiction or fantasy movie, they camped it up because they didn't want to be mistaken for people who took this stuff seriously. That, of course, has changed. I've had a wonderful working life making this, writing this stuff, which I really enjoy, and researching projects, which I really enjoy. Right now, I've just sold a series, another time travel series, by the way.
Okay, cool.
In which my protagonists, who are a history professor and 4 graduate students, get shoved back into Pannonia Superior, which is basically Austria, in the time of Marcus Aurelius in the 160s AD, and hijinks ensue. I've really enjoyed writing that.
Oh, that's cool. Sounds good. Well, that's it. So
that'll be called To Turn the Tide.
Are there any links for it up on Amazon yet? That we can
No,
make
not
sure?
yet.
Okay.
They're still negotiating the terms of the contract.
Cool. So, everybody, SM Sterling, everybody give him a round of applause. And thank you very much for being on
Do you know how many writers it takes to change a light bulb?
How many?
Forget about that. Let me tell you about my light bulb.
Exactly. And that will end on